The story begins in a university hospital, where the protagonist sits in silence in the doctor's office, his mind consumed by a single desperate thought: he wants to live. Again, he repeats to himself, clinging to the words with all his strength. He desperately wants to live. The doctor, having carefully examined the report in his hands, finally speaks. With a tone of disbelief, he admits that he has never encountered a case like this before. The disease is so unique that it will likely be named after the protagonist. A heavy silence follows before the doctor continues, offering his condolences. Based on the findings in the report, he says, the protagonist has no more than 6 months left to live. A wave of regret and disappointment washes over the protagonist as the weight of the diagnosis sinks in. Moments later, he finds himself wandering aimlessly through the bustling streets, his steps heavy, his eyes empty. The vibrant city around him blurs into the background, swallowed by the storm raging inside his mind. Suddenly, he stops in the middle of the road. His face twists in despair as reality crashes down on him. This is truly happening. He is going to die in half a year. Pedestrians around him pause, their gazes drawn to the motionless figure standing amidst the moving crowd. Some glance at him with curiosity, others with concern, silently wondering what could have happened to leave him so lost, so broken. At that moment, the protagonist thought about his life, realizing that all he had ever done was work diligently, like a tireless worker ant. For a brief moment, it had seemed as if things were finally looking up for him, as if his life was finally taking a turn for the better. But that moment had been fleeting, vanishing in an instant with the devastating news that he had only a few months left to live. With his mind consumed by this cruel reality, he resumed walking, his movements empty and lifeless. The world around him faded into nothingness, the bustling city drowned out by the overwhelming weight of his thoughts. He was unaware of his surroundings, too lost in the shock of what he had just learned. Then, a voice broke through the haze. A passing pedestrian, noticing him standing in the middle of the road, called out and urged him to move, warning him of the danger. Without waiting for a response, the pedestrian reached out and shoved him onto the sidewalk, forcing him out of harm's way. The protagonist stumbled and fell to his knees, his hands pressing against the cold pavement. As he landed, a piece of paper slipped from his pocket, fluttering gently to the ground. His gaze fell upon it, and in that moment, a bitter thought surfaced: how unfair it was to be told he had mere months to live, especially on this very day, the day he had won the lottery jackpot. As if the heavens themselves shared in his sorrow, the rain began to fall. Kneeling on the wet pavement, he lifted his tear-filled eyes to the sky, his body trembling as he repeated the same desperate words. He wanted to live. He did not want to die. His voice, raw with emotion, pleaded for someone, anyone, to save him from this cruel fate. And as he wept, the raindrops mixed with his tears, falling endlessly onto the cold, indifferent streets. Life sometimes follows a plan, and other times, it takes an unexpected turn. For the protagonist, it was both. His wish had been granted, he was able to live, but not in the way he had intended. Though he had desperately pleaded for life, he had never meant that he was willing to accept his current form. Out of all the possibilities, he could not understand why he had to be reincarnated as a bald skeleton. Worse still, there was little joy to be found in living this way. At present, he was on a mission, one that required him to complete a quest and conquer the battlefield by exterminating all rebellious forces. After countless battles against monstrous foes, he emerged victorious. As the last of the rebels fell, he took a moment to acknowledge his success. The mission was complete, and the final enemy had been vanquished. Thinking back to the moment of his reincarnation, he recalled the strange fate he had been given. Reborn as a skeleton, an inferior-class summon monster, he had started at the very bottom. Yet, through relentless effort and countless battles, he had grown stronger, eventually reaching the point where he evolved into an undead of a higher order, a lich. The day he ascended to this new form was unlike any other. Thousands of monsters, his loyal subordinates, erupted in celebration, their voices filling the air as they cheered for him. They called him their king, their undying sovereign. To them, he was more than a powerful undead, he was their savior. Through his strength and leadership, he had led demonkind out of the depths of despair, pulling them back from the brink of ruination and bringing prosperity to a race that had once stood on the edge of extinction. As the protagonist listened to the deafening cheers of his subordinates, he suddenly found himself blushing from the overwhelming praise being showered upon him. He might not have had any hair, but at least he was the great demon king. That thought alone gave him some comfort. The demon monsters called out to him, referring to him as Isaac, claiming that even his name sounded powerful and ominous. Their excitement only grew as they began chanting his name once again, their voices echoing across the battlefield. However, their enthusiasm quickly turned into an irritation for him. They had gotten his name wrong, again. With an exasperated sigh and an irritated demeanor, he reminded them that he was tired of repeating himself. What they were calling him was not his real name. His true name was Isaac. But just as he corrected them, his expression shifted, his irritation fading into amusement. Addressing his subordinates once more, he called them a bunch of numbskulls, pointing out how ridiculous it was that they could not even pronounce their own king's name properly. Then, without hesitation, he declared that it was time for him to bid them farewell. At that moment, one of his subordinates hesitantly stepped forward and asked where he was planning to go. Isaac responded without hesitation, he was going to claim what was rightfully his. As those words left his lips, his face lit up with joy. Finally, after all this time, he was going to achieve his ultimate goal. He would be able to eat, to feel pain, to experience life once again. He was going to become human. Moments later, Isaac arrived in the divine realm, standing in the presence of the gods. In his grasp was the severed head of the leader of the rebellious forces, a clear sign of proof that he had completed the quest. Facing the gods, Isaac declared that the task was done. He had eradicated every faction that had dared to challenge them. With a firm tone, he reminded them of their promise, hoping they had not conveniently forgotten. It was written in the contract, once the mission was complete, they were to return him to his human form. The gods were taken aback. The quest had been designed to take at least 500 years, yet Isaac had accomplished it within just a few. Murmurs spread among them, two of the gods whispering to each other in hushed voices. This mission had never been meant for him to succeed so quickly. It had been a carefully crafted scheme by the higher-ups, a ploy to turn him into their eternal servant without reward. Though they believed their voices to be discreet, Isaac heard them clearly. Without hesitation, he turned his gaze toward them and called them out. His tone was sharp, making it clear that their whispered deception had not gone unnoticed. Despite his skeletal face, his troubled expression was unmistakable as he questioned the gods. Why were they stalling? They had made a promise, if he took care of their enemies, they would restore his humanity. He had done everything they asked, fulfilled every condition, and yet here they were, finding excuses to delay. At that moment, one of the gods stepped forward with a bright expression and told Isaac that if he were to complete just one more task, they would undoubtedly grant his wish. However, upon hearing this, Isaac was consumed by rage. He knew exactly what was happening. The gods must have thought he was nothing more than an empty-headed skull, easily manipulated and deceived. Though he had no physical eyes, the sockets of his skull burned with a crimson glow, fueled by his growing fury. Without hesitation, he demanded to know what kind of fool they took him for. He was no pushover, and whether they were gods or not, they would pay for their deceit. The air grew thick with an overwhelming pressure as Isaac unleashed his magic, his aura distorting the very space around him. His power surged through the divine realm, shaking the foundations of their so-called authority. Glaring at them, he asked if they had truly made him go through all that effort despite lacking the means to turn him human again. In hushed voices, one of the gods turned to another, whispering that Isaac might have caught on to their deception. The other god let out a sigh, admitting that this was precisely why he had opposed the idea from the very beginning. He then questioned why she had ever agreed to make a contract with a lowly maverick like Isaac in the first place. But whispering was pointless. Isaac could hear them just as clearly as if they had spoken aloud. With a sharp tone, he addressed them once more, his patience long gone. Was this truly all they had to say for themselves? Isak then addressed the gods once more, declaring that as a being summoned through forbidden arts, he existed beyond the natural order. He was imperishable, unaffected by the passage of time, and incapable of dying from old age due to his undead nature. His very existence defied the laws of the world, making him a threat even to the divine realm itself. With a sharp and unforgiving tone, he turned to the gods and made his final declaration. If these incompetent deities were incapable of keeping their promise and lacked the power to return him to human form, then they would all pay the price with their lives. Panic spread among the gods as his words sank in. Desperate, they pleaded for more time, scrambling to find an excuse. One of them suggested that if Isak took care of just a few more problems for them, they would grant his wish. But Isak had reached his limit. His patience had long since worn thin, and his fury could no longer be contained. A surge of power erupted from him, engulfing the entire chamber in a blinding red aura. The divine realm trembled as the overwhelming force spread through the air, and the gods, now trembling, realized the situation had spiraled beyond their control. With a menacing laugh, Isak raised both hands, gathering a sphere of crackling energy, ready to unleash destruction upon those who had deceived him. The gods braced themselves, panic evident on their faces. But just as he was about to strike, everything changed. His magic flickered, then faded entirely. The once thick aura that had filled the room vanished, and a suffocating silence took its place. Confusion overtook him as he tried to move, only to find his body unresponsive. His voice broke through the silence, filled with disbelief. Something was wrong. His mana was fading. His body refused to obey him. Someone, had stripped him of his power. As Isak struggled to understand what was happening to him, one of the gods smirked and told him that resistance was futile. With a casual wave of his hand, the god summoned a magical pen, and in his other hand, a millipede appeared, its segmented body covered in intricate, glowing inscriptions. The god then explained that struggling would be pointless. Those whose names were written upon the creature would be rendered completely immobile, no matter where they were. This spell, known as Banished Disaster, was the highest class of holy arts, a technique created specifically to seal away catastrophic beings like Isak. With a smug expression, the god continued, saying that Isak should be grateful they had even allowed him to serve their purposes for so long. He was nothing more than a lowly demon, unworthy of challenging the gods. With that, the god declared that from now on, Isak would live his life as an insignificant bug. Isak, however, let out an exasperated sigh and retorted that if they were going to turn him into an insect, they could have at least chosen something like a fuzzy caterpillar. The gods, momentarily caught off guard, exchanged confused glances before asking why he was so obsessed with hair. Before they could press the matter further, the bug in the god's hand suddenly emitted a radiant golden light. The gods watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Unlike them, Isak was all too aware of what was unfolding. With a menacing laugh, he mocked the gods, calling them fools for taking too long to act. They had made a critical mistake. They had foolishly revealed their trump card without finishing him off first. And now, it was too late. As Isak spoke, his entire body began to glow with a brilliant golden light. With a defiant smirk, he declared that he would rather destroy himself than spend an eternity as a mere insect under the gods' rule. The gods, realizing his intent, scrambled to stop him, but it was already too late. Just before he detonated, Isak left them with one final insult, telling them to eat dirt. In the next instant, a massive explosion erupted, shaking the divine realm with its sheer force. When the dust finally settled, the gods remained intact, though visibly irritated by what had transpired. One of them scoffed, calling Isak insane for choosing to self-destruct rather than accept his fate. Turning their attention to the millipede in one of the gods' hands, the vessel meant to contain Isak's soul, one of them asked whether the sealing spell had successfully taken effect. The god holding the millipede examined it closely before nodding, confirming that the spell had activated and that the demon king's soul was now trapped within the creature. Hearing this, the gods collectively sighed in relief. One of them spoke up, stating that with the demon king gone, they should be able to regain their lost power. The others agreed, noting that every time a demon perished, the god's strength naturally increased. However, amid their celebration, one of the gods cautioned the rest, reminding them that they could not afford to lower their guard just yet. Though Isak had been dealt with, there was no telling when another calamity of his magnitude might be born. At that moment, one of the gods proposed creating the perfect vessel for a saint in the human realm, one capable of exterminating every last demon. Another god questioned whether he would be able to handle such a task, as it would consume a significant amount of his divine power. However, the first god dismissed their concerns, assuring them that he could manage. He then instructed the others to select a suitable soul to inhabit the saint's body. Turning his attention to the millipede, he sneered and declared that as for the insolent skeleton demon king, he would spend all eternity suffering as a lowly insect. A menacing grin spread across his face as he imagined the torment Isak would endure. However, unbeknownst to the gods, Isak was very much alive, and his soul had never been sealed inside the millipede as they had assumed. With his eyes closed, Isak reflected on his situation, chastising himself for having been deceived by the gods so easily. He wondered if he had truly lost his mind or if being a brainless skeleton had made him more gullible. As he continued his thoughts, a sudden brightness pierced through his closed eyes. Confused, he questioned why it was so blinding and instinctively tried to shield his face. But instead of skeletal fingers or insect limbs, he saw tiny human hands before him. A wave of warmth and dampness surrounded him, further adding to his bewilderment. Realization slowly dawned as he examined himself, and the thought struck him, he might have been reborn into the body of a human. Isak, still reeling from his unexpected situation, thought to himself that the gods must have wanted him dead, and he wondered if they had somehow messed up the seal. Just then, one of the maids spoke up, announcing that the saint, referring to Isak, had woken up. Isak was immediately confused, not understanding why they were calling him a saint. The maid, with a bright smile, asked why he had woken up from his nap, while a butler holding a bottle of milk commented that it would have been better if the baby had just kept sleeping. Isak, still disoriented, wondered where he was and what was happening. He questioned if the people in front of him were nannies and if, somehow, he had truly been transformed back into a human. One of the nannies spoke up, telling baby Isak that it couldn't be helped that he had woken up. Both nannies then flashed an unsettlingly evil smile. The maid, with a tone of false sympathy, told Isak that she felt bad about what was about to happen, but that they had their jobs to do. She added that, despite Isak just waking up, they needed him to go back to sleep, this time, forever. Panic surged through Isak as he heard those words. In that moment, he realized that he had just died, and now he was facing the terrifying prospect of dying again. The butler, with a menacing smile, apologized to baby Isak and told him that they were going to put him to sleep forever. As he said this, the butler stretched out his arms, holding the bottle, aiming to place it into Isak's mouth. However, just as the bottle neared Isak's lips, he quickly dodged it. Undeterred, the butler continued to try, again and again, attempting to feed him the bottle, but Isak skillfully dodged each time. The butler, both devastated and shocked, could not understand why Isak refused to drink what he was offering, while Isak, keeping his back turned, thought to himself that they must be joking with him. He had finally become human, so there was no way he was going to drink something so suspicious from the butler. In that moment, Isak shifted his thoughts, wondering how he had even become human in the first place. One of the two caretakers spoke up, telling Isak that he needed to eat like a baby should and sleep forever, soundly. They then referred to Isak as Sir Isaac. This caught Isak by surprise. He remembered that back when he was with the monsters, they would often call him Lord Isaac instead of his real name, Isak. It occurred to him that this was a mispronunciation of his name, and when the gods had written it on the millipede to banish him, they had mistakenly written it as Isaac instead of Isak. Isak, upon realizing the situation, thought to himself that this must be the reason he was still alive and breathing. Not only had he avoided being sealed, but he had also reincarnated into a different body with the same name. Laughing menacingly, Isak reveled in the fact that the gods had been fools, thinking they had defeated him, but in reality, they had failed to seal him away. However, as Isak continued to laugh, the butler suddenly forcefully placed the bottle in his mouth, startling Isak. Both parties struggled, with the butler asking the maid for help, as Isak, despite being a baby, was surprisingly strong. As Isak tasted the drink, his face turned pale at the horrible flavor of the vegetable juice. In his mind, he wondered if they were trying to kill him with such disgusting food. Having finally become human, he did not want to die again. As he continued drinking more of the awful liquid, Isak felt weaker and weaker. He could sense something ominous entering his body, and in that moment, he saw the menacing smiles of the maid and the butler. In the next instant, he passed out. Moments later, inside the Holy Empire Hela Central East Temple, an old man who had earned the title of bishop walked down the corridor, laughing menacingly as he thought about something. With a sinister smile, the bishop thought to himself that the baby, Isak, should be meeting his end right about now. However, just as he was lost in this thought, a voice called out to him, commenting that he seemed particularly lively. The bishop turned in the direction of the voice and saw none other than Emperor Alexander Heathcliff Hela, the ruler of the Holy Empire. The bishop, along with his subordinates, immediately bowed respectfully to the emperor. The emperor then spoke, asking the bishop what business he had there. With a light smile, the bishop replied that he and his subordinates had come to greet the saint candidate of House Ashwa and added that the Holy See must be present in regard to the Holy One. The emperor, his expression turning vicious, retorted that it sounded as though the bishop found this responsibility burdensome, especially considering it was a saint. He continued, warning the bishop that it would be a major problem if anything went wrong after the saint candidate was placed under the Holy See's care. The bishop, upon hearing the emperor's words and seeing his expression, began to panic. He feared the emperor might have discovered what he had done to the baby who had been announced as the saint. As the emperor spoke, the bishop quickly apologized, claiming to have no idea what the emperor was referring to. But at that moment, a cry echoed from the room where the baby was sleeping. At that moment, as the emperor spoke, a sudden voice was heard from the room where the baby was sleeping. The emperor, upon hearing the noise, was filled with panic, fearing something might have happened to the baby. On the other hand, the bishop, hearing the cry of the baby, smiled menacingly to himself, thinking that the job was done and the baby had been finished off. The emperor quickly ran toward the room, bursting through the door. In a state of urgency, he shouted at the maid, demanding to know what had happened to the young master, Isak. The maid, hearing the emperor's concern, calmly explained that the baby was so cute, she had unintentionally shouted in excitement. Everyone in the room was taken aback by her response. The maid then proceeded to point out how adorable Isak was, noting how plump the baby's belly had become and how well he had eaten. She described him as a cute little angel. Meanwhile, Isak, with a radiant smile, seemed to glow like an angel, embodying the image of innocence. The butler, joining in, commented on how much the baby had drunk, revealing that it was already the 15th bottle of tasteless vegetable juice that Isak had finished. The bishop, however, was far from pleased with the situation. Things were not going as he had planned at all. As he glanced at the multiple bottles scattered on the ground, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The baby, Isak, was still alive after consuming all of them, and the bishop muttered in disbelief that those bottles didn't just contain vegetable juices. Just a few minutes earlier, Isak had been fed one of the bottles that contained not only vegetable juice but also other mysterious contents. At that moment, Isak, feeling an ominous sensation spreading through his body, thought to himself that he was likely going to die again. The contents of the bottle seemed deadly, and he wondered if this was how he would perish. But as he processed the situation further, he was suddenly struck by realization: the liquid inside the bottle was not just some regular substance, but holy poison. Holy poison was a dangerous and insidious toxin, specifically crafted to destroy the holy powers of those in the clergy. It didn't have an immediate effect, but it was still deadly if enough accumulated in the body. However, in Isak's case, the poison was made from demon mana, and as a former demon king, it was the perfect substance for him. Far from being harmed by it, Isak found the mana-infused poison incredibly invigorating. Not only was it beneficial to him, but he also craved more, knowing it would help replenish his energy. With a feeling of contentment radiating from him, Isak, now emitting an aura of happiness, decided he would eagerly consume every drop of this mana-rich baby food being fed to him. As Isak thought about all of this, he suddenly began throwing a tantrum, clearly signaling to the maid and the butler that he wanted more of what they were feeding him. The butler, confused by Isak's actions, asked the maid if the baby wanted more of the strange liquid they had been feeding him. Seeing the baby's insistence, the butler hesitated for a moment but then took out another bottle, clearly troubled by the situation, and began feeding Isak again. As he did, he spoke to the baby, telling him that they were happy to continue feeding him this vegetable juice mixed with poison mana. While feeding Isak, the butler commented to the maid that this was to be expected, as the poison's effects wouldn't manifest immediately. They just needed to wait and continue feeding the baby in the meantime. Isak, on the other hand, was overjoyed by the prospect of more, happily accepting the bottle as his mana steadily increased with each sip. He couldn't help but compliment the person who had crafted this concoction for him, appreciating the effort they had put into it. As he drank, Isak shifted his focus. He thought to himself that what he needed to do next was to enter the world beyond the conscious mind, the unconscious realm. In the deepest part of this world, at its very source, Isak resolved to create a mana core. He recognized that this would become his safe haven, a place where he could grow stronger. As Isak celebrated his success, he quickly calmed himself and reminded himself to focus. He told himself that he needed to put the mana he had absorbed into the mana core. Gathering the mana within his body, he focused, and soon a bright yellow ball of mana began to form. As the ball took shape, Isak thought to himself that he needed the mana core to be able to use magic later. He decided to prepare it now so that it would be easier to use in the future. However, as the mana core continued to form, it suddenly began to glow even brighter than before. Isak's calmness faltered as he panicked, unsure of what was happening. This was not something he was controlling. He wondered if this was some sort of mana explosion. After a few moments, Isak took a closer look at the mana core and was startled to see something unusual. The mana core, which should have been one of the 3 primary colors, was instead white. Isak was confused. He had clearly remembered that a mana core should be one of the traditional colors. But as he pondered this, he quickly shifted his focus. The color, he realized, wasn't the main issue. The real problem was the sheer amount of power contained within this small, still-forming mana core. He couldn't believe how much energy was already present, even though the core wasn't fully formed yet. As Isak pondered the situation, a smile spread across his face. This turn of events was truly beyond his expectations. With that thought in mind, he took a step forward, approaching the mana core. Extending his hand toward it, he couldn't help but wonder just how many blessings had been crammed into the young body he now inhabited. The mere thought of it made him speak aloud, affirming that if he continued to grow at this rate, he might become an even greater monster than he had ever imagined. At that moment, a screen materialized before him, displaying a name, Isaac, with the word survive written beneath it. Without hesitation, Isak pressed the word survive. As he did, a deep realization surfaced within him. Ever since his time on Earth, there had been a desperate desire engraved into his very soul, the unyielding need to survive, no matter the outcome. It was that very drive that had led him to become the genesis of the Skeleton King, allowing him to create unique, original buffs and skills. Now, every ounce of knowledge, every skill, every buff, and every spell he had acquired in the past had been inherited by his current body. The mere thought of it filled him with exhilaration. As he silently celebrated his newfound potential, the butler and the maid observed him closely. The butler turned to the maid, his voice laced with curiosity, and asked if the baby had finally perished after consuming everything they had fed it. The maid, however, instructed him to check and confirm it himself. Just as the butler was about to step forward and verify, Isak suddenly raised his hand. The unexpected motion startled the butler, who had been convinced that Isak was no longer alive. Yet there he was, his small hand rising upward, shattering all expectations. Isak began making baby noises, his small voice filling the room. The butler and the maid exchanged confused glances, struggling to understand what he was trying to say. However, behind his innocent expression, a menacing smile tugged at his lips. In his garbled baby words, Isak was demanding another bottle of whatever they had been feeding him. He had no intention of stopping, he wanted to grow even stronger. Back in the present, the emperor let out a sigh of relief. Turning to one of his subordinates, he expressed how fortunate it was that nothing bad had happened to his child. Isak silently agreed with the emperor's words, though in his mind, he couldn't help but think that while it was true he had survived, he had also narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. He was alive, but the danger had been very real. As this thought lingered, Isak's gaze suddenly shifted toward one of the people in the room. His eyes locked onto the bishop, and in that moment, he noticed something unusual. There was an unsettling expression on the bishop's face, something dark and unreadable. A strange feeling crept into Isak's mind as he wondered why the bishop was looking at him in such a way. Had he eaten too much? Was that the reason behind the bishop's terrifying expression? The thought gnawed at him as he tried to make sense of the situation. Isak knew that no matter what, he could not afford to appear suspicious or let anyone uncover his true identity. With that in mind, he decided to feign complete ignorance about everything, the butler, the maid, and what they had done to him. He would act as though he had no idea what was happening. Instead of showing any sign of awareness, he chose to give everyone in the room the brightest, most innocent smile he could muster. As the thought settled, he beamed at them, his expression pure and carefree. The bishop, however, felt a surge of irritation the moment he saw Isak's face. His fury grew as he stared at the child, struggling to comprehend what was happening. By now, the baby should have been writhing in agony, coughing up blood, dying from the poison that had been fed to him. And yet, here he was, smiling, laughing, showing no signs of suffering whatsoever. The sight of it was infuriating. A few days earlier, at the headquarters of the Holy See, an announcement had shaken the core of the empire. It declared that whoever became the saint would gain control over the Holy Empire itself. The weight of such a proclamation had sent waves of chaos through the noble families. Recalling the announcement, a man rose from his chair, his voice laced with frustration as he addressed the bishop. He scoffed at the declaration, calling it a joke. Because of it, everyone was now scrambling to claim that one of their children was the saint. The situation had turned into a frenzy, and as he spoke, his irritation deepened. He added with disdain that the noble families were nothing more than troublesome pests. The bishop, upon hearing the mysterious man's words, immediately responded with a reassuring tone. He told the man there was no need for concern, adding that he and his men were already dealing with the other saint candidates. At that moment, the man's lips curled into a sinister smile as he commended the bishop for doing a good job. However, just as he finished speaking, his expression darkened, and he abruptly changed the topic. He mentioned that he had recently come across a rather unpleasant rumor. The bishop, hearing this sudden shift in tone, felt a wave of unease creeping over him. With a menacing glare, the mysterious man turned toward the bishop and revealed what he had heard. A saint candidate had allegedly emerged from House Ashwa, the emperor's most trusted ally. The moment the bishop saw the man's expression, fear gripped his heart. His voice trembled with panic as he hastily explained that there was nothing he or his men could do about House Ashwa. At that moment, the man's expression twisted with fury. In a fit of rage, he grabbed his glass of wine and hurled it to the floor, the sharp sound of shattering glass echoing through the room. Before the situation could escalate any further, the bishop quickly spoke up, his voice desperate. He assured the man that by now, the child from House Ashwa was most likely already dead. The man remained silent for a moment before finally responding. His voice was cold and commanding as he stated that he needed confirmation, the corpse of the child had to be verified. He then added that he would not allow the saint to come from any house other than his own, House Barrett. As he spoke, his lips curled into a cruel smile. This man, Harai Barrett, the head of House Barrett, stared down at the bishop, his gaze filled with chilling menace. Back in the present, the bishop stood close to Isak, his expression twisting in shock. He had been assured moments ago that the child would be dead, yet here the baby was very much alive. Rage boiled within him as he struggled to process the situation. This was not supposed to happen. He needed to do something about it. Meanwhile, the emperor observed the child with growing interest. He spoke up, remarking that the baby was truly fascinating. He then pointed out the child's striking platinum blonde hair, noting that it bore a remarkable resemblance to that of the Holy Empire's founder. As he made this observation, he turned to the bishop and asked if he agreed. The bishop, however, was thrown into a panic. The emperor was beginning to acknowledge the child, something he absolutely could not allow. His voice wavered slightly as he quickly interjected, urging the emperor not to speak such blasphemous words. Isak, watching the man who had been staring at him, came to a sudden realization. This man standing so close to him was the emperor himself. The emperor continued speaking, his voice carrying undeniable authority. He stated that the child's presence felt even closer to God than that of the current pope. With that declaration, he proclaimed that this baby must be the final saint candidate. Isak was momentarily struck with disbelief. He had just been referred to as a saint candidate. The revelation sent a shock through him, his soul had somehow ended up in the body of a saint candidate. In that moment, everything made sense. No wonder everyone had been speaking about saints in his presence. The bishop, watching the emperor's expression as he gazed at the child, felt nothing but unease. He could see it clearly now, the emperor was beginning to favor the baby. A dangerous realization settled over him. This could not be allowed to happen. The bishop spoke up, urging the emperor to follow him for a closer inspection of the child. The emperor, caught off guard by the sudden request, furrowed his brows and asked what the matter was. The bishop quickly added that there was something unusual about the baby. He pointed out that it was highly improbable for an infant to consume an entire serving of vegetable juice. However, the emperor dismissed the concern, questioning what was so strange about a saint candidate eating monk food. Lying on the bed, Isak found himself lost in thought. The irony of the situation was almost laughable. In his previous life, he had been a demon king, yet now, he was being proclaimed a saint candidate. The contrast was so absurd that he could hardly believe it himself. The bishop, unwilling to let the matter go, pressed the issue further. He acknowledged the emperor's words but insisted that the situation was still strange. He requested permission to inspect the child immediately. However, the emperor remained firm, stating that someone from House Ashwa would be arriving soon. He instructed the bishop to wait, assuring him that he could proceed with his inspection once they had arrived. Despite the emperor's words, the bishop persisted, growing more insistent by the second. Then, at that very moment, Isak accidentally let out a burp. As the sound echoed through the room, a faint wisp of demonic energy escaped his body, slipping out alongside the burp. The instant he realized what had happened, panic surged through him. His hands shot up, instinctively covering his mouth as his mind raced. The demonic energy that his body had been unable to fully suppress had just leaked out. His heart pounded as he anxiously wondered if anyone nearby had noticed. If they had, then there was only one terrifying possibility: he had just been exposed. As Isak grappled with his rising panic, a voice suddenly rang out, calling for the emperor. It was none other than the bishop himself. The moment Isak saw the bishop's expression, his stomach twisted with dread. The menacing smile on the bishop's face made it clear, he had noticed what had just happened. Fixing his gaze on the emperor, the bishop spoke with calculated precision, stating that he had just sensed demonic energy emanating from the child. He went on to emphasize how unnatural it was for such a presence to come from a mere infant. Isak's heart pounded as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The bishop had noticed. There was no denying it now. His mind raced in desperation, scrambling for a way out of this predicament. The bishop continued, his tone laced with conviction. He suggested that the child might be a false candidate bearing manna and insisted that an inquisitor should be brought in to investigate immediately. Isak clenched his fists in frustration, regret gnawing at him for the mistake he had just made. The emperor, upon hearing the bishop's accusations, erupted in anger. His voice carried sharp authority as he demanded to know how the bishop dared to speak ill of a saint candidate. However, the bishop remained unfazed. With a calm yet insidious tone, he informed the emperor that there was no need for concern, as the pope had already chosen the child from House Barrett as the saint. At that moment, realization dawned on the emperor. He instantly understood the game that was being played. The actions of the bishop and House Barrett were shameless, a blatant attempt to secure the title of saint for their own bloodline while eliminating any competition from other noble houses. Isaac, too, grasped the situation with growing fury. This was the reason they had been so desperate to get rid of him. They needed him gone to ensure that no other candidate could stand in their way. The bishop lifted Isaac into his arms, his gaze scrutinizing the child as he spoke. Without hesitation, he ordered a priest to summon an inquisitor to examine the baby. However, before the priest could act, the emperor's commanding voice cut through the room, ordering the bishop to stop. The emperor reminded the bishop that House Ashwa was the imperial family's closest ally and firmly suggested that the child's reassessment be postponed to a later date. The bishop, hearing the emperor's words, nodded in apparent agreement, stating that he would comply with the emperor's decision. Yet, as he spoke, a menacing undertone crept into his voice. He then informed the emperor that he had recently spoken with the pope, who had declared that the investiture ceremony for the crown prince would only take place after the saint's selection. The emperor's expression darkened at the revelation. He immediately understood the implications. This was the pope's way of pressuring him into accepting House Barrett's chosen saint. Without the pope's recognition, his son would not be officially acknowledged as the heir, putting the imperial succession in jeopardy. Isaac, hearing all of this, burned with frustration. He resented being dragged into such a convoluted power struggle. The situation was spiraling further out of his control, and he knew remaining a saint candidate was too great a risk. If his true identity were exposed, he would be doomed. Before Isaac could dwell further on his predicament, the bishop spoke again, this time suggesting that they conduct the inspection immediately using their holy exorcism art to clear any doubts. Faced with no alternative, the emperor had no choice but to agree. The bishop's lips curled into a sinister smile as he declared that if the child were found to be a demon, they would exterminate him immediately. However, just as he finished speaking, Isaac seized his bottle and, with a powerful swing, struck the bishop squarely on the head. The impact was so forceful that several of the bishop's teeth flew from his mouth. Isaac, witnessing the aftermath, beamed brightly and let out an innocent, childlike laugh. Yet, beneath that adorable facade, he relished the moment, thinking to himself that the bishop had received exactly what he deserved. Determined to play along with the bishop's charade, Isaac prepared himself for what was to come. The bishop, still reeling from the unexpected attack, winced in agony. His mind raced. How could a mere baby wield such strength? How could a simple bottle strike cause him this much pain? Before he could dwell on the thought any further, murmurs arose among the onlookers. A radiant golden light had begun emanating from Isaac's small body, drawing gasps of astonishment. Observers speculated in hushed voices whether the light was a manifestation of holy power. The emperor, observing the phenomenon, confidently declared that the child must truly be the saint. The bishop, still clutching his throbbing face, struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. Only moments ago, he had sensed demonic energy from the child, yet now, the baby radiated pure holiness. How could this be possible? Before he could find an answer, Isaac struck again. With the same bright, innocent smile, he swung his bottle once more, delivering sharp blows to the bishop's face, left and right. Blow after blow landed, the bishop completely powerless to stop him. Meanwhile, the spectators remained captivated by the golden light pouring from Isaac, marveling at the display. The bishop, however, barely registered their awe, his mind fixated on a singular realization. This power the child was using. It had to be mana. Isaac focused his energy on the bottle, channeling a strengthening spell to reinforce it. In that moment, he decided to deliver one final, devastating strike to the bishop while maintaining the guise of an innocent baby. With a well-timed swing, he landed a powerful blow, sending the bishop collapsing onto his knees. The onlookers, witnessing the bishop kneeling before the child, murmured among themselves, wondering if he was overcome with reverence for the holy power radiating from Isak. Meanwhile, Isak felt something peculiar as he wielded his magic. He noticed that whenever he used mana, he could sense a faint trace of holy power accompanying it. This realization intrigued him. Mana and holy power were fundamentally incompatible, incapable of coexisting within the same vessel. He quickly deduced that the phenomenon must be linked to his unique white mana core. Before he could reflect further, the bishop, seething with rage, suddenly snatched the bottle from Isak's hands. Rising shakily to his feet, he turned to the emperor and the gathered spectators, his voice filled with fervor. Swearing upon his very being, he proclaimed that the child in his grasp was a heretic and must be subjected to the holy exorcism ritual immediately. Isak, now thoroughly exasperated by the bishop's relentless persistence, narrowed his eyes mischievously. With a sly smirk, he admitted to himself that he had not intended to take things this far, but now, he would. Acting swiftly, he reached into the bishop's pocket and pulled out an object, his expression brightening with amusement. He had just uncovered something far more interesting than he had anticipated. The bishop immediately panicked as the baby seized the object hidden in his pocket. Isak was now holding a sealed high-ranking demon's corpse, an artifact known as a totem. This item was designed to harness the unique ability of demons, who consumed the corpses of their kind to absorb mana. The bishop, his mind racing, recalled that he always kept the totem with him as a precaution, intending to use it as a weapon against demons should he ever encounter one. However, he had never expected the child to discover it, let alone expose it so openly. Isak, on the other hand, flashed a menacing smile before hurling the totem onto the ground. With a chilling certainty, he told the bishop to watch closely, declaring that this was the direct consequence of his relentless pursuit. The moment the totem struck the floor, Isak flicked his hand, activating his power. In an instant, the seal broke, and a powerful demon emerged from within. Gasps of shock and horror filled the chamber as the dark entity took shape. Isak, watching the unfolding chaos, smirked to himself, daring the bishop to deal with the situation he had unwittingly created. The room fell into stunned silence as the entity revealed itself, a shadow lich, an incredibly dangerous and malevolent being. The emperor, his expression darkening, turned sharply toward the bishop, Martha Barrett, his voice laced with fury. He demanded to know how such a demon had been unleashed within the sacred temple, questioning whether the bishop had lost his mind. Martha, frantic to defend himself, immediately denied responsibility, claiming that it was not he who had freed the demon, but rather the child who had thrown the totem to the ground. Before he could say another word, the emperor cut him off, his tone cold and unforgiving. He reminded the bishop that a totem was merely a vessel meant to seal a demon. If the creature had returned to life, then something far more sinister was at play. The emperor swiftly turned his attention to the demon and, without hesitation, commanded his men to protect the young lord from both the wicked beast and the bishop. His soldiers responded instantly, their voices ringing out in agreement as they moved into formation. One of the emperor's men stepped forward, approached the bishop, and carefully took the baby from his grasp. The bishop stood frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend how the situation had spiraled so drastically out of his control. Meanwhile, Isak watched the scene unfold with a sinister smile, his gaze locked onto the bishop. Inwardly, he mocked him, calling him a fool, and wondered how he would manage to escape the predicament he had so recklessly brought upon himself. The emperor's soldiers encircled the demon, their weapons drawn and poised at its throat. However, something was clearly amiss. The creature, rather than attacking outright, began muttering the same phrase over and over again. Its voice, guttural and filled with malice, repeated a chilling command, to kill the saint. As its ominous chant continued, the demon suddenly let out a deafening roar, its eyes fixating on Isak. It then declared with unrestrained fury that it would kill the child, the so-called saint. A flicker of genuine concern crossed Isak's face as he realized he was now in serious danger. The demon, without warning, lunged straight for him. Before it could get any closer, the emperor's men sprang into action. Moving as one, they positioned themselves between Isak and the rampaging beast, their blades flashing as they launched a coordinated assault to stop it in its tracks. As Isak watched the demon charge toward him, he couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. Why was the creature attacking him when he had just saved its life by freeing it from the totem? It made no sense. However, as he pondered this, his initial concern began to fade. He was confident that the paladins would be able to protect him, no matter how much the demon wanted him dead. But reality proved to be far from what he had expected. In an instant, one of the paladins was sent hurtling backward at an alarming speed, crashing into the wall with enough force to leave him gravely injured. Isak's eyes widened in shock. He had assumed these warriors were among the strongest, yet one had already fallen in the blink of an eye. He briefly wondered if the man writhing on the floor was truly a paladin. The situation only worsened from there. One by one, the remaining paladins met the same fate, each being effortlessly overpowered by the rampaging demon. The creature continued its relentless assault, all while repeating its chilling words, it was going to kill the saint. But then, it added something new. It declared that it would also rescue the captured king. The paladin holding Isak was visibly trembling, his fear evident as he struggled to comprehend the sheer strength of the monster before them. Meanwhile, Isak remained utterly unfazed, his expression calm and collected. In that moment, he considered his options. He knew he could subjugate the demon himself, but there was one problem: he couldn't afford for anyone to notice that he was using magic in a situation like this. As Isak pondered his next move, the demon charged toward him once again, its voice filled with murderous intent as it declared that it would kill him, the so-called saint. Yet, despite the imminent danger, Isak remained calm. He couldn't help but wonder why, even in this life, everyone seemed so determined to kill him. His frustration only grew as he realized that even the very demon he had just revitalized was now turning against him. Fury surged within him. Without hesitation, he activated his magic, and in that instant, a terrifying image emerged, the shadow of his former self as the Demon King. The moment the demon laid eyes on it, its entire body froze in sheer terror. Recognition dawned upon it, and its attack came to an abrupt halt. The baby it had been so eager to destroy was no mere infant. It was the Demon King himself. As the demon stood paralyzed, Isak's body began to radiate an intense, blinding light. The glow grew stronger with each passing second until it enveloped the entire room. The instant the light touched the demon's body, it began to burn. Realizing the danger it was in, the demon panicked. It knew it was moments away from being completely annihilated. Desperate to survive, the creature turned on its heels and fled before Isak could finish it off. The paladins, witnessing the demon's attempted escape, immediately sprang into action, trying to intercept it. However, their efforts were in vain. The demon was far too fast, and in an instant, it had vanished from sight. As the room fell into silence, one of the paladins finally spoke, his voice filled with awe. He declared that the power displayed by the young Lord Isaac, Isak's current identity, was undoubtedly holy power. Not only had Isaac driven away a greater demon, but he had done so at such a young age. It was nothing short of extraordinary. Isak carefully observed the power flowing within him, and in that moment, he confirmed his suspicion: the energy he had just wielded was indeed holy power. The realization took him by surprise. As he pondered how to gain full control over this newfound ability and bend it to his will, another thought struck him. He had completely depleted his mana. The excessive use of his power had drained him entirely. Reflecting on this, Isak wondered if the peculiar nature of his new body was converting his mana into holy power. The implications of this frustrated him. If his mana was being transformed, then how was he supposed to replenish it, especially in the Holy Empire, a land notoriously lacking in mana? The situation was far more complicated than he had anticipated. Meanwhile, the bishop was being restrained by the paladins, his face contorted with rage as he struggled against their grip. Furious, he demanded to be released, shouting at the men holding him down. His fury quickly turned toward Isaac, his voice dripping with venom as he accused the child of being a heretic who wielded the power of demons. His anger only intensified as he cursed the infant for daring to set foot within the Holy Empire. Turning to the emperor, the bishop vowed that he would prove the child's true nature. With unwavering conviction, he declared that he would expose the baby's real identity through an exorcism. However, before he could continue, the emperor spoke, his voice cutting through the room with authority. He commanded the bishop to be silent, stating firmly that he had heard enough. His expression darkened with fury as he warned the bishop not to dare accuse an innocent saint candidate without evidence. The emperor, his fury evident, turned his gaze back to the bishop and spoke with unwavering authority. Beyond all the bishop's transgressions, the emperor reminded him that he had also allowed a greater demon to be unleashed before the imperial knights. His eyes burned with anger as he declared that he would not overlook this matter lightly, regardless of the bishop's standing within the Holy See. The bishop, recognizing the severity of the situation, knew he was in grave danger. If the emperor's suspicions deepened, it would only be a matter of time before the infiltrator was exposed. Should that happen, even the Holy See itself could face dire consequences. In that moment, the bishop resolved that, even if he had to die to take responsibility, he would ensure the survival of his family. For that reason, he made a desperate decision: he had to eliminate the saint candidate of House Ashwa. With that thought, the bishop activated his powers, and a massive wolf-like creature materialized behind him. Without hesitation, the beast lunged straight for Isaac. Yet Isaac remained unfazed. Watching the creature charge toward him, he calmly noted that the bishop had finally revealed his true nature. A smirk played on his lips as he considered how the bishop genuinely believed he could kill him. However, his confidence quickly faltered as he abruptly realized the dire truth: his mana was completely depleted. He had exhausted every last bit of it. As the beast rushed toward him, Isaac found himself staring at it in helplessness. But just as the monstrous creature was about to reach him, its head was suddenly severed from its body in a clean, precise strike. At that moment, a commanding voice rang through the hall, demanding to know who had dared to lay a hand on the direct lineage of House Ashwa. The man who had spoken was none other than Rely Ashwa, the seventh son of House Ashwa. The entire room fell into stunned silence, eyes widening in shock not only at Relay's presence but also at the sight of the Ashwa knights standing behind him. Without hesitation, Rely stepped forward, pointing directly at the bishop as he issued a firm command to his men: they were to execute the bishop immediately for his crimes. The knights, without question, acknowledged his order. The bishop, now seized by the knights, struggled against their grip, his voice rising in frantic protest. He screamed at them to release him, warning them not to dare lay a hand on a bishop of the Holy See. Meanwhile, Isaac quietly observed the unfolding scene. His mind turned to the name Ashwa, which had been mentioned multiple times. There was something familiar about it, something buried deep in his memory, but he could not immediately place where he had heard it before. Rely then turned his attention to Isaac, his expression softening as he addressed him. With a respectful tone, he instructed his knights to show proper decorum toward the young master of House Ashwa. At that moment, all the knights of Ashwa bowed deeply before Isaac in unison. Rely then spoke again, this time addressing Isaac by the name Isaac. With a slight bow of his head, he apologized for arriving late. Isaac, however, was less concerned about the apology and more impressed by the knights of Ashwa. From what he could see, they were far superior to the imperial knights in both discipline and presence. With a bright smile, Rely then added that, although it was not much, they had brought a small present for him. Hearing this, Isaac's thoughts immediately turned to gold, hoping that the so-called gift was something of monetary value. However, as one of the Ashwa knights reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out the present, Isaac's expectations were quickly shattered. The knight, still smiling, presented him with a figurine, a miniature depiction of the skeleton king, mid-execution, with its head being severed. Isaac stared at the figurine for a long time, unable to process what he was seeing. The skeleton king depicted in the small statue was none other than himself before he had been reincarnated into the body of the baby he now inhabited. But the knight did not stop there. With great enthusiasm, he revealed another figurine, one where the skeleton king was being burned alive, and yet another where the saintess was crushing him beneath her heel. Terror gripped Isaac as he looked at each of them, realizing that every figurine portrayed a different, gruesome way in which he had been tortured to death. The knights, on the other hand, were brimming with joy, admiring the figurines while fawning over how adorable he was as a baby. Meanwhile, Isaac was on the verge of tears, completely overwhelmed. He had no idea how he was supposed to survive in a house full of people who gleefully celebrated his past suffering. As he wallowed in regret over his situation, a memory surfaced, one that finally explained why the name Ashwa felt so familiar. It was the name of the saintess who had once come to end his life when he was still the demon king. The recollection deepened, and he remembered those who had fought against him in his past life. One after another, they had introduced themselves with the same title, the 45th Saintess, Ashwa, the 61st Saintess, Ashwa, and so on. Realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Every single person who had opposed him in his past life had carried the title of Ashwa. And now, not only was he reborn as a saint candidate, but he was also part of the very family that had spent generations trying to destroy him. The cruel irony of his fate made him want to scream. What had he done in his past life to deserve this? As Isaac was lost in thought, the bishop suddenly spoke up, cursing the Ashwa family for their actions. However, before he could continue, one of the Ashwa knights quickly silenced him. Yet, the bishop was not so easily deterred. With a furious expression, he turned to the knights and accused them of heresy, claiming he had always known they were nothing more than corrupt individuals. Without hesitation, he demanded to know where they had brought the creature, Isaac, from, declaring that he would uncover the child's true identity. His outrage only grew as he continued, his voice ringing with condemnation. He declared that he could not believe the Ashwa household had dared to bring such a monster into the Holy Empire. He accused them of madness, insisting that their actions would bring about the downfall of the Ashwa bloodline. But just as he finished his sentence, Rely stepped forward, drawing his sword in one swift motion. With precise control, he delivered a shallow slash across the bishop's throat, a small but deliberate cut meant to silence and intimidate him. The room fell into a tense silence as Rely calmly lowered his blade. His voice was steady as he addressed the bishop, reminding him that he should be grateful for the benevolence of the Ashwa family, who had chosen to spare his life despite the absurdity of his accusations. As Isaac watched Rely slash the bishop's throat without hesitation, he couldn't help but think that Rely was quite useful. The knight had acted purely because the bishop had insulted the Ashwa family, and that level of loyalty made Isaac conclude that Rely had the confidence to stand against even the Holy See itself. One of the Ashwa knights, however, grew concerned and spoke up, worried that the young lord had heard something terrible. He insisted that Isaac should only be exposed to good things, shielding him from negativity. Observing the knights more closely, Isaac suddenly recalled an important detail. The ones currently guarding him were Blue Ashwa Knights, an elite order renowned for their strength. Memories from his past life surfaced, reminding him of how his own subordinates had always reacted in fear at the sight of a Blue Knight. Now, as he watched them attempt to cheer him up by showing him yet more figurines depicting the gruesome demise of the Demon King, he was beginning to understand why his former followers had been so terrified of them. At that moment, the Emperor finally spoke, his tone thoughtful as he remarked that it seemed he owed the child a debt. Without hesitation, he called out to Rely and ordered him to inform the head of the Ashwa household that the imperial palace wished to raise the child. Rely, upon hearing this, immediately responded, telling the emperor that his jokes were far too extreme. Isaac was taken aback upon hearing that the imperial palace was attempting to recruit him. The idea of being scouted by the emperor himself was unexpected, and he struggled to process the implications. The emperor spoke again, his tone firm as he pointed out that the Holy Empire would inevitably target the child, both from within and beyond its borders. He then turned to Rely, reminding him that he was well aware of this fact. While the Ashwa household was undeniably powerful, the emperor expressed doubt that the present blue faith of the Ashwa family had the strength to protect the child. Rely remained silent, carefully considering his response. Meanwhile, Isaac was left confused, unable to grasp the deeper meaning behind their conversation. The emperor continued, stating that the Pope, above all others, would never approve of the child. The very color of Isaac's hair carried symbolic meaning, tied to the ancestors of the Holy Empire. More troubling, however, was the claim that the skeleton king seemed to be pursuing the child. Isaac, upon hearing this, was bewildered. As the former demon king himself, he couldn't understand why he would be after his own reincarnation. Before he could dwell on it further, Raleigh stepped forward, taking Isaac from the knight's hands. Bowing slightly, he offered an apology to the emperor but firmly stated that the child belonged to the Ashwa bloodline and, as such, must be raised within the household. Without hesitation, he declared that the Ashwa family would handle the Pope, the skeleton king, and any other threats that arose. If they were ever to encounter the demon king again, Raleigh added, the previous saintess, Melissa, would be pleased. At this, the emperor smiled in amusement and agreed that Melissa would indeed be happy. Raleigh continued, firmly stating that he could not entrust the direct descendant of Saintess Melissa to the imperial palace. Meanwhile, Isaac was still trying to process everything that was being said. The name Melissa lingered in his mind, and as he searched through his past memories, his expression froze in shock. He finally remembered who she was, none other than the same Melissa he had fought right before ascending to the divine realm. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. Melissa had been a crazed saintess, the most formidable opponent he had ever faced. Now, the truth of his current situation became painfully clear. Not only had he been reborn as a candidate within the saintess family, but he was also Melissa's direct descendant. The sheer absurdity of it all made him internally question why his life had turned out this way. What exactly was a saintess? The gods, having suffered defeat at the hands of the demon king time and time again, had grown desperate. In their determination to achieve victory, they poured all their divine efforts into creating a final weapon, the saintess. Described as a mace sent by the gods to smite evil, the lion of the battlefield who wielded holy light, the greatest beacon of the Holy Empire, and its highest-ranking knight, the saintess was a being of unparalleled power. With attack and defense capabilities said to rival those of the gods themselves, many believed that the demon king's reign would finally come to an end. But their strength did not stop there. The saintesses possessed an unnatural resilience, often compared to cockroaches in their ability to survive even the most devastating attacks. If the situation demanded it, they would self-destruct without hesitation, ensuring their mission was fulfilled. And as if their terrifying battle prowess were not enough, they were also considered goddesses of beauty, growing stronger with each new generation and boasting unnaturally long lifespans. Yet despite all this, the demon king had remained merciless. Isaac reflected on the past, realizing that he had never actually killed a saintess. Doing so would have been pointless, as their holy power would simply return to the gods, who would then create an even stronger successor. Eliminating one would only lead to an upgraded version appearing in their place. However, as he thought about Melissa, the formidable opponent he had once fought, he couldn't help but feel shocked to learn that she was his ancestor. Raleigh then spoke with conviction, stating that the sole purpose of a saintess was to bring about the destruction of the demon king. He went on to explain that the Ashwa household was responsible for producing these saintesses, carrying out the will of the gods with unwavering dedication. He emphasized that the Ashwa family was proud and more than capable of protecting the child. The emperor, hearing these words, remained silent, listening intently without offering a response. At that moment, another knight from the Ashwa household stepped forward and addressed the emperor, supporting Relay's claim. He asserted that countless saintesses had been martyred by the demon king throughout history. Isaac, however, felt his irritation rise upon hearing this statement. He knew for a fact that he had never killed a single saintess during his time as the demon king. Their assumptions were completely mistaken, and the way they spoke about it only made him more frustrated. Isaac recalled an encounter from his past when a saintess had come to confront him. Instead of fighting her, he had banished her to a labyrinth, deeming her unworthy of battle. It wasn't his fault, he reasoned, that she had been terrible with directions and ended up losing her life as a result. As he thought about the other saintesses, he remembered that around 5 of them had died from stress-related illnesses. That, too, wasn't his fault. If they had been struggling, they should have gone to a hospital for treatment instead. Frustration welled up inside him as he reflected on these events, but before he could dwell on it further, Relai spoke, his voice calm and reassuring. He told Isaac that it was fine, that he understood the child's situation, and that it didn't matter to him or the others that Isaac was cursed. Isaac, however, was far from fine with it. The mention of a curse made him wonder what exactly Relai was referring to. Lifting Isaac up with a bright smile, Relai told him that they were grateful for his birth. He then added that they had only one wish, that Isaac would not grow up to become like the terrible demon king. Hearing those words, Isaac's expression turned lifeless. He was the demon king himself, so he had no idea how to respond. In that moment, a wave of guilt washed over him. He thought of the parents he had yet to meet and silently apologized to them for being the very person they despised. The emperor spoke again, urging Relai to reconsider his proposal. He reminded him that it had been 150 years since the demon king was sealed away. Isaac, upon hearing this, was taken aback. He hadn't realized that so much time had passed. If it had truly been that long, then Melissa should have died long ago. After all, she had already been 50 years old when he last fought her. The emperor continued, stating that in the meantime, the demons had only grown stronger. He emphasized that the saint was a crucial asset to the Holy Empire, a means to increase its power, and for that reason, the child was just as important to the imperial palace. Furthermore, the emperor pointed out that there was currently no saintess in Ashwa. A year had passed since the last saintess had given birth to the boy and then disappeared along with the father. Isaac was stunned by this revelation. He had never expected his mother to be a saintess. Relai, however, remained firm. He acknowledged that what the emperor had said might be true, but he countered that the matriarch of Ashwa was still alive and that the household was more than capable of protecting the child. Meanwhile, Isaac tried to steady his thoughts. He told himself that he needed to come to terms with all these shocking revelations. After all, nothing could be more surprising than learning that his own mother was a saintess. Just when Isaac thought he had come to terms with the situation, an even bigger shock hit him. The emperor casually asked Relai if Dame Melissa was still out destroying the Demon King's army. Relai confirmed that she was and added that she would return soon, as the matriarch was expecting to meet her grandson. Isaac froze. If Melissa was still alive, that meant she was now over 200 years old. How was that even possible? He had been certain she wouldn't have lived this long. The weight of this realization made him sulk, his mind spiraling at the absurdity of it all. The emperor, noticing Isaac's change in demeanor, turned to Relai and asked if the child was all right, finding his behavior unusual. Relai reassured him that the child would be fine, but Isaac strongly disagreed. He was not fine, far from it. His greatest enemy was still alive, and if Melissa were to discover his true identity, he would be smited on the spot. Isaac quickly assessed his situation. If it had been any other saintess, he might have been able to manage, but Melissa was different. She was dangerous. There was no way he could take any risks. He needed a survival strategy, and fast. Thinking through his options, he came up with the only solution that might work. He had to leave before Melissa returned. With that in mind, he took action. Reaching out, he grabbed the emperor's hand and, with all his might, channeled his greatest weapon, his cuteness. He needed to make himself irresistible, to make the emperor want to take him along. Just as he had predicted, his plan worked flawlessly. The emperor, utterly captivated by Isaac's adorable expression, was now completely won over. The emperor, noticing how tightly Isaac was holding onto his hand, pointed out that it was clear the child wanted to go to the imperial palace. However, Relai, unwilling to let Isaac slip away, immediately countered that the boy was simply being clingy and that there was nothing more to it. The emperor then asserted that the imperial palace could provide far more for young Isaac, emphasizing that while the Ashwa household had extensive experience in producing saintesses, they had no precedent for raising a saint boy. Relai, however, remained steadfast, declaring that Isaac would become an exorcist knight who would vanquish evil, as the Ashwa household was renowned for producing the greatest exorcist knights. He then pointed out that since Isaac was the first ever male saint, neither the imperial palace nor Ashwa had any prior experience in raising one. The argument quickly escalated as the emperor and R'lyeh began tugging at Isaac from both sides, each insisting that the child belonged with them. The emperor firmly stated that the imperial palace was the best place for Isaac, while R'lyeh adamantly argued that the Ashwa household was where he should remain. Caught between the two, Isaac found himself struggling under the relentless pulling from both sides. The tension grew so intense that one of the knights finally spoke up, urging the two to calm down before they accidentally tore the young master in half. Meanwhile, Isaac had already made up his mind. He wanted to go to the imperial palace. He had no intention of staying where he might end up dead. As he observed the emperor, he noticed the faint glow of light that resonated with his instinct for survival. It had been coming from the emperor all along, meaning his chances of staying alive would be much higher if he went with him. Determined not to miss this opportunity, Isaac prepared to move toward the emperor. However, just as he was about to do so, he suddenly noticed an even brighter light appearing. It was not coming from the emperor. Confused, he hesitated, wondering where this new light was coming from. As night fell, a group of men in black cloaks surrounded the bishop, who was on his knees, trembling and pleading for his life. Desperation filled his voice as he insisted that he was innocent, claiming that the child had used mana and was undoubtedly a spawn of the demons. However, the cloaked men remained unmoved by his words. One of them stepped forward and, with a cold voice, stated that holy power came from the gods themselves. He then asked the bishop if he was truly suggesting that the gods had granted divine power to a mere demon. As he spoke, he drew his sword, and the bishop, seeing this, began to panic. Frantically, he reaffirmed that he was certain the child had been using mana, insisting that there was no way he could have mistaken it for holy power. Before he could finish his plea, the man cut him off with a menacing glare. He then stated that such talk was considered blasphemy in the holy city. Terror consumed the bishop as he begged for mercy, but his pleas were in vain. In that very moment, the blade struck, and his life came to an abrupt end. One of the cloaked figures then turned to their leader and suggested that they form another assassination squad to eliminate the child. However, the leader dismissed the idea, stating that there was no need for such measures. He explained that the emperor intended to take the child, which meant they would have plenty of opportunities within the imperial palace. With a sinister tone, he declared that once the child was within the palace walls, there would be no escape. This time, survival would be impossible. Over the next few days, Isaac woke up to find himself inside a moving carriage. As he opened his eyes, he couldn't help but reflect on how his carefully laid plans had taken an unexpected turn. Although he had originally decided to go with the emperor, he was now on his way to the Ashwa household instead. The reason for this sudden change lay in what had happened a few days prior. Just as Isaac was about to leave with the emperor, he noticed a brilliant light shining, not from the emperor, but from R'lyeh himself. The radiance was so intense that Isaac had to shield his eyes. At that moment, R'lyeh spoke, acknowledging that the Ashwa household was not an ideal environment to raise a child. He then added that the emperor likely viewed Ashwa as nothing more than a house filled with mana corpses and the remains of demons. Meanwhile, Isaac was still trying to determine if the light emanating from R'lyeh was related to the survival origin. However, before he could come to any conclusion, R'lyeh continued speaking, revealing something truly shocking. The most valuable possession of the Ashwa household was none other than the body of the demon king. Isaac was stunned by this revelation. He could hardly believe that they had possession of his body. In that moment, he thought to himself that R'lyeh should have led with this information, as there was no doubt in his mind, if his body was there, then going with Ashwa was the obvious choice. Just as R'lyeh was about to continue speaking, Isaac immediately shifted his approach. No longer trying to win over the emperor, he turned his cuteness toward R'lyeh instead. With his small hands, he grasped R'lyeh and gave a thumbs up, making it clear that he wanted to go with him. R'lyeh, captivated by Isaac's display of innocence, was completely won over. And so, this was how Isaac found himself in his current predicament, on a carriage bound for the Ashwa household, heading toward an uncertain yet intriguing future. As Isaac rested inside the carriage, he couldn't help but feel as though he was trading the comforts of palace life for the rigors of military service. However, he knew this was a necessary sacrifice. Regaining his old body was his top priority, as the skeleton body he had once refined had accumulated vast amounts of mana, enough to challenge even the gods. If he could reclaim it, dealing with the gods would be a trivial matter. Beyond that, this was the first time he had ever seen the light of the survival origin shine so brightly. That alone was proof that following Uncle Rely to Ashwa would significantly increase his chances of survival. Just then, one of the knights spoke up, directing a question toward Rely. He asked why the forces of the Holy See were still relentlessly pursuing young Master Isaac. Hearing this, Isaac couldn't help but share the knight's curiosity. Why was he such a big deal? Rely responded, explaining that the gods had prophesied that the saints would be taken in as the sons of a god. Isaac was caught off guard by this revelation, struggling to process what he had just heard. The knight, just as surprised, then asked if this meant that the next saint would eventually become the next pope. Rely confirmed that this was indeed the case, which was why House Barrett was so desperate to produce a saint. Isaac, still trying to make sense of everything, found himself increasingly bewildered by the situation. None of this aligned with what he had expected, and the more he learned, the more confused he became. The Pope was the strongest cleric, capable of casting rank 10 holy spells, and was practically the ruler of all clerics and paladins. An absolute being whose power rivaled even that of the Holy Empire's emperor, the Pope had always been born into House Barrett for thousands of years. However, with the prophecy stating that the next pope would be a saint rather than a member of House Barrett, it was no surprise that they were in an uproar. Isaac realized that this was also why the other noble houses were desperately trying to produce a saint of their own. As he pondered this, a voice suddenly called out to Rely. Startled, Rely turned to look outside, trying to assess the situation. The carriage driver then spoke, informing him that they had arrived at the duchy but had encountered a problem. A group of guards stepped forward, and one of them, addressing Rely and his men, offered an apology before coldly stating that they would not be allowed to enter the duchy. Isaac, still inside the carriage, wondered what was happening, while Rely stepped out, his expression darkening. With a furious tone, he demanded to know how they dared to speak that way to members of the House of Ashwa, questioning whether they had received any proper education at all. Did they even understand who they were dealing with? However, as soon as Rely said this, the guard smirked menacingly. With an unsettling grin, he declared that it was only natural for them to deny entry, as their true goal was to eliminate the child who carried the blood of the saintess. At that moment, the guards revealed their true nature, their bodies shifting grotesquely as their disguises melted away, exposing them for what they really were, demons masquerading as humans. The knights were taken aback by the sudden revelation, stunned to see demons standing before them. Isaac was just as shocked. The situation made no sense to him. He clearly remembered that during his reign as the Demon King, he had placed a strict ban on demons attacking human territories. If this was happening now, it could only mean one thing: the new Demon King had overturned his decree. One of the demons stepped forward, sneering as he addressed Rely and the others. With a tone dripping with arrogance, he declared that their glorious king had issued a command: all saints and saintesses were to be exterminated. Hearing those words, Isaac's suspicions were confirmed. There really was a new demon king in power. The demon continued, his voice filled with unwavering conviction. He announced that under the command of the great skeleton king, Lord Isaac, they would carry out the execution of the saint child. At that moment, Isaac's expression darkened. His irritation grew as he listened to the demon speak utter nonsense. He had never once given such an order, nor had he ever told them to commit these atrocities. The demon then turned to Rely and made a final offer. If they handed over the child, the mighty skeleton King Isaac might consider sparing their lives. Before the demon could say another word, Rely unleashed his power. In an instant, the demon was reduced to ashes. The remaining demons recoiled in horror, their confidence shattered. Panic spread among them as one of them, his voice trembling with rage, accused Rely of being a cowardly paladin for striking before they had been prepared. Rely was seething with rage. His voice, laced with fury, cut through the tension as he warned the demons not to spew such nonsense in his presence. He was the Ashwa of exorcism, and he vowed that the demons would not be granted an easy death. Raising his sword, he pointed it directly at the demons and commanded them to listen well. For the sake of protecting even the smallest and most fragile lives in the world, Ashwa would eradicate all evil. They would pursue the demons to the depths of hell itself, ensuring their complete annihilation. His words ignited the spirits of the knights around him. Fired up by his declaration, they moved into position, ready to engage in battle. Rely smirked as he looked at the demons and spoke once more. Their so-called mighty demon king was nothing more than a coward, sending his subordinates to their deaths in a futile attempt to escape mortality. His words struck a nerve. The demons bristled with rage, their expressions twisting with fury. One of them shouted in defiance, demanding that Rely not dare to insult the great demon king Isaac. In that instant, the demons launched themselves forward, their voices ringing out in unison as they cried that all things were for the revival of their king. As the battle erupted, swords clashed and divine power flared against dark magic. Amidst the chaos, one of the knights rushed to the carriage and swiftly grabbed hold of Isaac. Apologizing for the sudden action, he shielded the boy from the fight. Meanwhile, Isaac remained deep in thought, his mind racing. Someone was impersonating him as the demon king. But who? And why? The knight who had taken hold of Isaac had managed to put a considerable distance between them and the battlefield. Once they had reached a safe spot, he carefully placed Isaac behind a thick bush and instructed him to stay there until the fight was over. He assured Isaac that he would return shortly before casting a protective barrier around him, ensuring no harm would come his way. Observing the barrier, Isaac silently acknowledged its strength. Even high-ranking demons would struggle to break through it. It was impressive that the knight had the ability to cast such a formidable spell. However, Isaac also realized that while nothing from the outside could penetrate the barrier, nothing from within could escape either. Understanding this limitation, Isaac closed his eyes and activated his survival origin, unleashing his magic. With a commanding tone, he called out to the one who was both magic and living, the Whispering Observer. The moment those words left his lips, a demon materialized before him, instantly rushing toward Isaac with overwhelming joy. The demon, calling Isaac his master and referring to him as the Demon King, expressed his deep longing, overwhelmed with emotion at their reunion. However, Isaac, finding the demon's excitement excessive, pushed him away and reminded him that while it had been a long time since they last met, now was not the moment for loud greetings. He warned the demon, Whisper, to keep quiet, or they would both be discovered. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.